So track 3 on EP is Plastic Vortex. This was written in 2021 for the Symbiosis project I've talked about in the other videos. And this track shows a different side to Fractus. So on the one hand we have the more classical and composed side, and then Plastic Vortex shows this more improvised and group improvisation kind of approach. This is by far the simplest piece I've probably ever written. It's 4 chords and they just loop from beginning to end. And that was really like the basis for allowing all the musicians in the band to improvise over this idea. And I feel like the simpler the structure, the simpler the idea, the more space there is to improvise. So we'll begin by just listening to these 4 chords to hear how they sound, and then we'll look at how that is developed through the whole piece. So you can hear this starts very quietly, very softly, just piano. And you can also see from the waveform in this piece how the basic idea in this tune is for it to build, and that's always been the idea. So when we play it at gigs, there aren't really preconceived ideas of what it should be or what it should sound like, but we all understand that it should build in volume and intensity. That's the only instruction really. And you can see here the waveform just builds and builds. So because of the simplicity of this piece, I wasn't sure where to actually notate this for the band, because as I said, it's 4 chords, and because it's so simple, I wasn't sure if it was actually necessary to write it down. But because it was part of this Symbiosis suite and everything else was written down, I did make a very simple chart for everyone to follow. So if we take a look at the score, we can see we have the 4 chords outlined, and these go round and round. And for everyone, it's kind of the same instructions, apart from the piano. And I told Fergus, who was playing piano on this, to basically vary this as much as he likes. For everyone else, I just gave this very simple instruction, lots of effect sounds. So what I mean by that is anything that's very textural and colorful and sometimes melodic, but basically exploring your own instrument and finding sounds within basically one scale. So because this is a very simple piece, there are a few things we need to do to make it interesting, because after hearing 2 bars of music, a few times, you're already ready for something to change. So there are a few things which I came up with and the band came up with in order to make it more interesting. So the first thing was rhythm, and I talked about how rhythm can make repeating patterns a lot more interesting in the Smog video. And it's kind of the same thing here, where the time signature is kind of ambiguous. When I was writing it and just playing it on the piano into my voice memo app, I couldn't really decide on what time signature it was. It didn't feel like it should fit into one unit of time. But because I knew it was going to build and eventually a groove would come in, it did need to have some kind of structure. So I chose 5/4. It's not really 5/4 in the sense that there's a groove that really marks 5 beats. It just so happens that it sounds about right being about 10 beats. And you could also make the argument that this piece is really a bar of 3/4, a bar of 4/4, and then a bar of 3/4. But I thought it was easier to just notate as 5 and see it as one section. Now, although the piece is one structure, it's one bit of music, we can sort of divide it into 2 sections. And basically there's the build and then after the build. So for the majority of the piece, it's building in intensity and volume and just it's getting busier. And then we reach this kind of climax where, again, we're still playing the same groove, it's the same chords. There are a few things that make it a little bit different. So I chose to have this violin repeating line come in, and it just gives it a bit of a different character, and because it's using these 16th notes or semiquavers, it gives it a bit of a different texture compared to a lot of the more washy and textural stuff we've heard before. So before we get to this violin line, let's have a listen to what happens before that. So as this builds, we're building more in terms of instruments. They're sort of being staggered. So we're starting with the piano, then the bass comes in, and then the other instruments all follow after that. So we're building an intensity. And the first kind of checkpoint, or the first kind of landmark we reach, is when the bass switches from playing these quite textural bowed sounds, which sound like this, and then when the bass switches to playing pits, so playing with the fingers, which has a slightly more percussive sound, and that I think starts to drive the piece forward a little bit. So once the bass changes from arco to pits, from bow to fingers, I'd say the next thing which is noticeable to me is more melodic fragments start to enter. So Matt on sax goes from playing sort of longer notes to playing these shorter melodies. And you also hear, instead of just separate textures and colors are on their own, there's more of interaction between everyone. So it's going from this blanket into this more interactive feature. And then the next part in the build is the drums going from very washy open sounds to more of a groove. So the groove begins with Greg. He's playing brushes. He changes from this lighter groove to a heavier groove. There's more cymbals. There's more of everything, really. It's really cool that in this recording, we all chose a similar time to start this second part of the build. There's this very slow build that begins, but then you can hear everyone slightly changes what they're doing and it just goes up a gear. So Matt's really bringing in a lot more intensity. There's a lot more happening in the violin. The drums are getting a bit louder, a bit groovier. The piano is becoming heavier. The bass is becoming heavier. And you can hear, in particular, Fergus is going from just playing these simple chord shapes to then expanding them, and then he's starting to play more melodic and sort of soloistic phrases in his right hand. So in order for everyone to line up for the main kind of climax of the piece, there was one indicator that we had to say that this is the point where we're going to this part of the tune. And the thing we used was myself on bass playing the lowest note I could, which was an F. And this F really opens up the whole piece. So up to this point, I've mostly been playing in the upper register of the bass, in the middle, and really avoiding the lower strings. And it sounds a little bit empty, but that's on purpose because I want to make the biggest part of the tune feel even bigger. And so playing this really loud low note was a great indicator that, okay, now we're at the climax of the tune. And as we reach the climax of this tune, you can hear the violin come in with that repeating pattern. So we'll have a quick look at that. So if we have a look at this in Symbiosis, you can see, even if you can't read music, you can see that it's basically 4 or 5 notes repeating. And originally we had this in pizzicato because I liked the percussive sound, but when that came to practically playing it, even in a recording or live, it just wasn't cutting through at all. So we changed that to be on the boat. So if we just have a listen to that on its own. Because we're in an odd time signature of 5, and we're mostly using a repeating structure of 8 notes, it means it takes a while for this to resolve, or it resolves in a strange place. So the idea was to change it in the second half of this violin phrase. But because it doesn't resolve in a natural place, it means you get this cool sort of friction between the groove and the violin. So when you put that in context, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so the other thing that I think makes this section really work is, and one of my favorite moments I think from the whole EP, is the interaction between Matt and Irini. After we played this bit a few times, it begins to settle a little bit, and I think as a band we just naturally begin to fade that out. Because we've reached this really high energy point, it does take a while to come back down, and it feels a bit sudden if we just all drop down at the same time. So in a very controlled way we try and bring the energy down back to just piano. So recording wise, we recorded most of this live all together. The only exception was we recorded the vocals separately. We also added a couple of extra violin layers. And so in the background, in places you can hear these tremolo notes in the violin, and you can hear just some extra color to give it a little more depth. In terms of inspirations, there wasn't really a particular piece or particular artist I had in mind when I was writing this, or that I was listening to a lot at that time. I'd say this is when I had just discovered Olafur Arnold, so I was really enjoying just these simple repeating chordal patterns. So there is one tune of his called Particles, which is, again, it's 4 chords being looped for the whole piece. It's very, very different from this tune, but it's similar in concept of making 4 repeating chords interesting. There was a lot of trial and error when it came to writing these 4 chords, because if you're going to write a piece that only has 4 chords and it just repeats through the whole piece, you need to make sure those chords really work together and that they can hold their own for the duration of the piece. So for Plastic Vortex, it was really a case of just trying different chords and just trying to find a sequence that was almost hypnotizing and didn't feel like it needed to go anywhere else. And it took me a while, but eventually settled on these 4 chords. The title for this piece, Plastic Vortex, comes from when I was reading about something called the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. There are various kinds of reportings on what the garbage patch is, but essentially it seems to be this swirling vortex of plastic that's broken down in the Pacific Ocean, and the way the currents in the Pacific work mean that it's just swirling round and round. And I thought it was quite a hypnotic idea, just this plastic going on endlessly, never really breaking down, just going round and round the ocean. And so when we played this for the first time for the Symbiosis concert, it was really cool to have visuals for this, to have visual artist Ross Blair from Trench One. It really made this piece more immersive, I think. Yeah, but that's it for this piece. There's not much to it, so there's not a ton to talk about. We've got 2 more of these videos, one on Sifting Tides and Harbour, that will be coming up. If you have any questions, you can write a comment below. Please check us out. Support us on Bandcamp, Spotify, wherever you like, and see you next time.